I found out about the credit cards when I was 16. By then I already owed $23,000 to companies I'd never heard of. Mom started asking for my social security number when I was around 13, saying she needed it for insurance paperwork or doctor appointments, and I never thought anything of it because why would I? She was my mom, and you trust your parents with that kind of information, even though now I realize how stupid that sounds. The first time she asked, I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and she came in with this stack of papers looking stressed about something. She said the insurance company needed to update my information and could I write down my social security number on this sticky note real quick. I did it without even looking up from my math textbook because I was trying to finish before my shift at the ice cream shop that evening. After that, she asked for it maybe 3 or 4 more times over the next year, always with some official sounding reason. Once it was for school registration, even though I'm pretty sure the school already had it. Another time she said it was for taxes. I remember that one specifically because Dad had just gotten laid off from the factory and Mom kept saying we needed to make sure everything was filed correctly so we could get the biggest refund possible. She made it sound like she was being responsible and taking care of important adult things that I didn't understand yet. Dad's layoff happened right before I started high school, and the whole atmosphere in the house changed after that. He'd sit in the living room watching TV all day, applying for jobs on his laptop during commercial breaks, but nothing was coming through. Mom worked part-time at a dental office doing billing and scheduling, but it wasn't enough to cover everything we needed. They started fighting about money almost every night after I went to bed, but our house was small enough that I could hear them through the walls. Mom's voice would get high and tight when she was stressed, and Dad's would go low and mean. He'd accuse her of spending too much at the grocery store, and she'd fire back about his truck payment and how he refused to sell it even though we were struggling. I started working at Scoops when I was 14, mostly because I wanted my own money for clothes and going out with friends. Mom had always been weird about spending money on anything she considered unnecessary, and after Dad lost his job it got worse. She'd make comments about how much my shoes cost or how I didn't really need a new backpack when my old one was perfectly fine even though the zipper was broken and I had to use a safety pin to keep it closed. Working felt like freedom because I could buy things without having to justify every purchase or listen to her sigh about the family budget. The job was fine, I guess. My manager was this college guy named Marcus who was usually hungover during morning shifts but was decent about letting us take extra breaks when it was slow. I worked mostly evenings and weekends scooping ice cream and ringing up customers and pretending to care when someone wanted to sample 6 different flavors before ordering vanilla. The pay was minimum wage, but I usually made another 20 or 30 in tips each week if I smiled enough and acted enthusiastic about people's flavor choices. By the time I was 15, I had saved up almost $2,000 in a savings account that Mom helped me open at her bank. She said it was important to start learning about money management early and that having savings would teach me responsibility. I felt proud of that account, even though I know now that $2,000 isn't actually that much money. But at the time it felt huge, like I was really accomplishing something. I'd log into the banking app on my phone just to look at the balance and watch it grow every time I deposited my paycheck. Mom would ask me about work, constantly wanting to know how much I made each week and whether I was being smart about saving. At first I thought she was just being a concerned parent trying to teach me good habits. She'd say things like, "You don't want to end up like your father, spending every dollar and having nothing when an emergency happens." Dad would get quiet when she said stuff like that, and I'd feel uncomfortable sitting there at the dinner table while tension built up around us. The summer before my junior year, Mom started having problems with her car. It was this old Honda that she'd been driving since before I was born, and something was always breaking on it. First, the air conditioning stopped working, which she said she could deal with even though it was brutal driving around in July with all the windows down. Then the transmission started making this grinding noise that got louder every day, until finally the car just wouldn't shift into third gear anymore. The mechanic told her it would cost $2,800 to fix, or she could trade it in and get something newer, but of course we didn't have $2,800 and her credit was apparently too bad to get approved for a car loan. She came home from the mechanic's shop looking defeated and sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands for a long time. Dad was in the living room scrolling through job listings and pretending not to notice. I asked if she was okay, and she looked up at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was calculating something. She said everything was fine, she just needed to figure some things out. That night I heard them fighting again through my bedroom wall. Mom's voice was sharp, saying something about how she needed a car to get to work and what were they supposed to do if she lost her job. Dad's response was too quiet to hear, but I could tell from Mom's reaction that it wasn't helpful. A few days later, Mom asked if we could talk privately. We sat in her car in the driveway with the windows down because the AC didn't work, and she explained that she was in a really difficult position. The car situation was critical because without transportation she couldn't get to her job, and if she lost her job we'd lose the house. She started crying, which made me uncomfortable because Mom never cried in front of me. She said she'd been trying to handle everything on her own, but she couldn't do it anymore and she needed help. Then she asked if I would be willing to lend her some money just temporarily until she got back on her feet. I didn't even hesitate. She was my mom and she was crying and she needed help. I told her of course she could borrow money and asked how much she needed. She said if I could lend her $1,500 that would cover the down payment on a used car she found, and she'd pay me back as soon as possible. I remember feeling kind of proud that I had enough saved to actually help with a real adult problem. It made me feel mature, like I was contributing to the family in a meaningful way. We went to the bank that same afternoon and I withdrew $1,500 in cash. Mom kept thanking me over and over, saying I was saving her life and she didn't know what she'd do without me. She said we were a team now, working together to keep the family stable. I felt good about it, driving home with her hand squeezing my shoulder, telling me how responsible and mature I was. She got the car 2 days later, a gray Nissan that was about 10 years old but ran better than the Honda. She drove me to work in it that week and kept saying how grateful she was that I'd helped make it possible. The thing about lending money to family is they never actually write down terms. Mom said she'd pay me back as soon as possible, but what does that mean? A month? 6 months? A year? I didn't ask because it felt rude to demand details when she was struggling so much. But after a few weeks, when I checked my savings account balance and saw how much it had dropped, I started feeling anxious about it. I'd worked so hard to save that money, scooping ice cream and dealing with rude customers and cleaning disgusting bathroom messes. Watching that number get so much smaller made my stomach hurt, even though I knew I'd done the right thing by helping. I tried bringing it up casually once about a month after I gave her the money. We were making dinner together and I mentioned something about my savings account and how I was trying to build it back up. Mom got this defensive tone and said she was aware she owed me money and she hadn't forgotten, but things were still really tight financially. She said she was doing her best and could I please not pressure her when she was already stressed about everything else. I apologized immediately because I didn't want her to think I was being ungrateful or unsupportive. After that, I didn't mention it again. Around October of my junior year, I started getting mail addressed to me that looked official. The first envelope came from a company called Capital Credit Services, and I opened it thinking it might be some kind of student loan information or college stuff. Inside was a statement showing I owed $3,847.52 on a credit card account that was 90 days past due. I read it 3 times trying to understand what it meant because I'd never had a credit card in my life. There was an account number and a list of charges dating back almost 2 years for things like gas stations and grocery stores and utility payments. I took the letter to Mom completely confused, asking her if this was some kind of scam. She barely glanced at it before saying it was probably just junk mail and I should throw it away. But it didn't look like junk mail, it looked real with official letterhead and specific account information. I asked if maybe someone had stolen my identity and Mom got irritated, saying I was being paranoid and these companies send fake bills all the time trying to scare people into paying debts they don't owe. She told me to stop worrying about it and focus on my schoolwork. But more letters kept coming. Different companies, different amounts, all claiming I owed money on credit cards I'd never applied for. I started keeping them in a folder in my room because even though Mom said they were fake, they felt real and scary. One statement from a department store card showed I owed $4,200 with interest accumulating daily. Another from a major credit card company listed a balance of $7,300 that had gone to collections. I tried talking to Mom about it again, but she got angry, saying I needed to stop obsessing over junk mail and that worrying about this stuff was going to give me an ulcer. I probably should have pushed harder or asked someone else for help, but I didn't know who to ask. Dad was barely functional at that point, spending most of his time in the garage tinkering with broken electronics he found at thrift stores. My friends wouldn't have known what to do with this information, and I was embarrassed about the whole situation. It felt shameful somehow, like I'd done something wrong even though I couldn't figure out what. I started having trouble sleeping at night, lying in bed staring at my ceiling, wondering if I was going to get arrested or sued or have my college applications rejected because of this mysterious debt that kept appearing in my name. The phone calls started in November. The first one came while I was at school and went to voicemail. A woman with a stern voice stated my name and said she was calling from Recovery Solutions Group regarding a seriously past due account. She said I needed to call back immediately to discuss payment arrangements and left a number. I listened to the message 3 times, feeling sick to my stomach. This didn't sound like a scam, this sounded like a real person at a real company demanding real money. More calls followed over the next few weeks, sometimes multiple calls in one day. Different companies, different voices, all saying essentially the same thing. I owed money I wasn't paying and legal action would be taken if I didn't respond. I started letting all calls from unknown numbers go to voicemail because I was too scared to answer. The voicemail box on my phone filled up with increasingly aggressive messages. One guy said my wages could be garnished. Another woman said they could place a lien on any property I owned. A third caller mentioned something about a court judgment. I finally broke down and told Mom about the calls in early December. She was sitting at the kitchen table paying bills online, and I interrupted her, showing her my phone with all the voicemail notifications. I was trying not to cry because I felt so overwhelmed and scared. I asked her to please help me figure out what was going on because I couldn't handle it anymore. She stared at my phone for a long time without saying anything. Then she closed her laptop and told me to sit down because we needed to talk. Mom explained that she had opened a few credit cards in my name over the past couple years. She said she'd only meant it as a temporary solution to help the family get through a rough financial period after Dad lost his job. The plan had been to pay everything off before I turned 18 so it wouldn't affect me, but things hadn't worked out the way she expected. She said she'd been making minimum payments when she could, but recently it had become impossible to keep up with all the bills and some of the accounts had gone delinquent. She kept saying how sorry she was and how she'd never meant for it to get this bad. I sat there unable to process what she was telling me. My mom had taken out credit cards in my name without telling me, and now I owed thousands of dollars to multiple companies. I asked her how much the total was, and she got defensive, saying she wasn't exactly sure, but it wasn't as bad as it seemed. I asked her to give me a number, any number, and she finally admitted it was probably around $15,000 or maybe $20,000. Then she started crying again, saying she was a terrible mother and she'd made a huge mistake, but she'd been desperate and didn't know what else to do. Part of me wanted to comfort her because she was crying and saying she was terrible. But a bigger part of me was furious in a way I'd never been before. She had stolen my identity. She had destroyed my credit before I was even old enough to legally have credit. She had put me in debt that would take years to pay off while I was still in high school, trying to figure out how to apply to colleges and plan for my future. I stood up from the table and went to my room without saying anything because I didn't trust myself to speak without screaming. I spent that night researching credit card fraud and identity theft online. What I found was confusing because most of the information was about strangers stealing your identity, not parents using their kids' social security numbers to open accounts. A few articles mentioned that this happens sometimes in families and that it was technically illegal but difficult to prosecute because it involved parents and children. One legal forum had a whole thread of people sharing stories about parents who'd ruined their credit, and the comments were full of advice about filing police reports and disputing the charges and freezing your credit. Filing a police report against my own mother felt impossible even though I was angry. She was still my mom, and despite everything, I didn't want her to go to jail. But I also didn't want to spend the next 10 years paying off debt I didn't create for purchases I didn't make. I felt trapped between protecting my future and not destroying my family. Dad still barely knew what was going on, and I wasn't sure if he'd been aware of what Mom was doing or if she'd hidden it from him too. The next morning I told Mom I wanted to see all the statements from every account she'd opened. She tried to say it didn't matter and we'd figure something out, but I insisted. I said I needed to know exactly how bad the situation was, and if she didn't show me, I'd find another way to get the information. She finally agreed and spent the next hour digging through drawers and folders, pulling out bills she'd been hiding. We spread them across the dining room table and I started adding up numbers. 7 credit cards. Total balance of $23,347. Some of the accounts were close to their limits. Others had gone to collections. All of them were in my name with charges I'd never authorized for things like groceries and gas and utility bills and Mom's car payment. Looking at that spread of papers, I felt dizzy, like the room was tilting. This wasn't just a mistake or a temporary solution, this was systematic financial fraud that had been going on for almost 3 years. Mom kept apologizing and explaining how each charge had seemed necessary at the time. The gas was so she could get to work. The groceries were feeding our family. The utility bills kept the lights on. She framed everything as sacrifices she'd made for us, like she was the victim in this situation. But I was 16 years old with almost $25,000 in debt, and I hadn't bought a single thing on any of those cards. Every charge was hers, every purchase was her decision, and now I was the one who'd spend years dealing with the consequences. I asked her what her plan was to fix this. She didn't have one. She said maybe she could consolidate the debt or work out payment plans, but when I asked for specifics, she got vague and started crying again. I realized there was no plan, there had never been a plan. She'd just been spending money on credit in my name, hoping somehow the problem would solve itself or disappear, or maybe she hadn't thought that far ahead at all. School became almost impossible to focus on after that. I'd sit in class staring at the whiteboard while my teacher talked about polynomial equations or the Spanish-American War, and all I could think about was debt and interest rates and collection agencies. My grades started slipping, not dramatically, but enough that my teachers noticed. My English teacher, Mr. Harrison, pulled me aside after class one day, asking if everything was okay because I seemed distracted. I told him I was fine, just tired from working too much. He gave me this concerned look and said I should talk to my guidance counselor if I needed help with anything, but I just nodded and left. The calls kept coming throughout December and January, getting more frequent and more aggressive. I started answering some of them just to make them stop. I'd explain that I was 16 years old and hadn't opened these accounts, but the collection agents didn't care. One guy told me age didn't matter if my social security number was on the account. Another woman said I was trying to commit fraud by denying the debt. They'd demand payment immediately or threaten legal action, and I'd hang up feeling shaky and nauseous. Mom kept promising she was working on solutions, but nothing changed. She'd mentioned talking to a bankruptcy lawyer or looking into debt relief programs, but then weeks would go by with no progress. Meanwhile, more mail arrived, more calls came in, and my credit score, which I finally checked online, was 487. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but the website explained it was considered very poor and would make it nearly impossible to get approved for car loans or apartment rentals or student loans. My financial future was destroyed before I'd even graduated high school. I tried talking to Dad about it in February, but that conversation went nowhere. I found him in the garage organizing his tool bench and asked if he'd known what Mom was doing with the credit cards. He got quiet for a long time before admitting he'd known she'd opened 1 or 2 cards, but didn't realize it had gotten so out of control. I asked why he hadn't stopped her, or at least told me, and he said Mom had assured him she had everything under control and he'd trusted her judgment. Then he went back to sorting screwdrivers like the conversation was over. I felt completely alone in dealing with this. My parents had created the problem but weren't helping solve it, and I didn't know who else to turn to. The school counselor felt like an option, but I worried they'd call CPS or something and make everything worse. My friends wouldn't understand this was too complicated and too embarrassing to explain to people my age. I started spending more time at work just to avoid being home, where every conversation with Mom either turned into her apologizing uselessly or getting defensive about how hard she'd had it. Marcus, my manager, noticed I was taking extra shifts and asked if I was saving up for something big. I told him I was trying to build up my college fund, which was technically true even though college felt impossible now with my credit destroyed. He said that was smart and asked if I'd ever thought about going into management because Scoops was looking for shift supervisors and the pay was better. I applied that same week and got promoted by March, which added an extra $2 an hour to my pay. It felt like the first good thing that had happened in months. With the promotion, I was working 25 to 30 hours a week on top of school, which meant I was constantly exhausted. I'd get home around 10 p.m. on weeknights after closing shifts and still have homework to finish before I could sleep. My grades continued dropping despite my teachers offering extensions and extra credit. I just didn't have the energy or focus to care about Spanish vocabulary or chemistry labs when I was dealing with collection calls and trying to figure out if I'd even be able to go to college with destroyed credit. Mom started avoiding me around this time. She'd leave for work before I woke up and go to bed right after dinner, claiming she had a headache or was tired. When we did talk, it was surface-level stuff about what was for dinner or whether I needed a ride somewhere. She never brought up the credit cards anymore and would change the subject if I tried to mention them. It was like she'd decided that ignoring the problem would make it disappear. In April, I finally told someone outside my family about what was happening. There was this regular customer at Scoops named Mrs. Chen who came in every Friday for a small vanilla cone and always tipped well. She was probably in her 60s, worked as a family law attorney, and was friendly in that way where you could tell she actually cared about people. One slow evening when it was just her and me in the shop, she asked how I was doing, and something about her tone made me break down completely. I told her everything. The credit cards, the debt, the collection calls, Mom's refusal to fix it, my destroyed credit. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, letting me talk through all of it while I scooped her ice cream with shaking hands. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before asking if I'd considered getting legal help. I explained I didn't have money for a lawyer and didn't want to get my mom arrested. Mrs. Chen said she understood, but that this was serious financial abuse and I needed to protect myself even if it was uncomfortable. She gave me her business card and told me to call her office on Monday. She said she primarily did family law, not financial cases, but she could point me toward resources and help me understand my options. I took the card, feeling grateful and terrified at the same time. Getting actual legal help felt like crossing a line that would make everything real and permanent. But I also knew I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for my mom to magically fix a problem she'd created and shown no ability to solve. I called Mrs. Chen's office that Monday during my lunch period, stepping outside to the parking lot so no one would overhear. Her receptionist connected me, and Mrs. Chen spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about the accounts when they were opened, how much I owed, whether my mom had my permission. I answered everything as honestly as I could, even though some of it was embarrassing to say out loud. She said what my mom had done was definitely illegal and that I had a few options, including filing a police report disputing the charges with the credit bureaus or working out a payment plan with the creditors. Each option had downsides. Filing a police report meant my mom could face criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. Disputing the charges might require me to prove I hadn't authorized them, which could also lead to investigations of my mom. Working out payment plans meant accepting responsibility for debt I didn't create, which felt deeply unfair. Mrs. Chen was honest that there was no easy solution, and whatever path I chose would be complicated and painful. She offered to connect me with a colleague who specialized in consumer protection law if I wanted to explore my options further. I took the referral information and thanked her before hanging up. Then I sat in my car in the school parking lot staring at the business card she'd given me weeks earlier, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pursue legal action to clear my name and protect my future. But another part couldn't shake the guilt about potentially getting my own mother in trouble with the law. She'd made terrible decisions, but she was still my mom, and despite everything, some part of me wanted to believe she'd been trying to help the family, even if she'd gone about it in the worst possible way. I didn't call the consumer protection lawyer right away. Instead, I went home and confronted Mom one more time. I found her in the kitchen making dinner and told her we needed to talk seriously about fixing this situation. I said I'd spoken to a lawyer who'd explained that what she'd done was illegal and that I had options to protect myself. Mom's face went pale and she asked if I'd reported her to the police. I said no, but that I needed her to take real concrete steps to resolve the debt, or I'd have to consider other options to protect my financial future. She promised she would. She said she'd contact all the creditors the next day and work out payment plans. She'd look into debt consolidation. She'd get a second job if necessary. She was crying again, but this time I didn't feel sympathy, I just felt tired. I told her I'd give her 2 months to show real progress, and if nothing changed by then, I'd have to take legal action to protect myself. She agreed to the timeline, and I left the kitchen feeling like I'd just delivered an ultimatum to my own mother, which made me feel guilty and angry and sad all at once. 2 months passed and nothing significant changed. Mom did contact a few creditors and supposedly set up payment plans, but I never saw proof, and the calls from collection agencies continued. She claimed she was looking for additional work but never seemed to actually apply anywhere. It became clear that her promises were just words meant to buy time and avoid real accountability. I was done waiting for her to fix a problem she'd spent 3 years creating and ignoring. I called the consumer protection lawyer Mrs. Chen had referred me to in late June, right after school ended for the summer. His name was Michael Rodriguez, and he agreed to meet with me for a free consultation. I drove to his office, which was in a strip mall next to a nail salon, and explained the entire situation from the beginning. He took notes and asked clarifying questions and didn't seem shocked or judgmental about any of it. When I finished, he told me this unfortunately wasn't uncommon and that he'd worked with several young people whose parents had destroyed their credit through similar means. Michael explained that my best option was to file identity theft reports with the credit bureaus and the Federal Trade Commission. This would allow me to dispute the fraudulent accounts and potentially have them removed from my credit report. However, the credit card companies might investigate, and if they determined my mother was responsible, she could face criminal charges. There was no way to clear my credit without potentially putting my mom in legal jeopardy. I asked if there was any way to avoid that. Michael said technically I could accept the debt as mine and work out payment plans, but he strongly advised against it. At 16 years old, I'd be taking on over $20,000 in debt that wasn't mine and spending years paying it off while my mom faced no consequences for committing fraud. He said I needed to think about my future and my ability to go to college, rent an apartment, or buy a car someday. All of those things would be nearly impossible with destroyed credit and massive debt. He was right, but it didn't make the decision easier. I left his office with paperwork to file the identity theft reports and a sick feeling in my stomach about what would happen when I submitted them. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could play out. My mom getting arrested. Our family falling apart even more than it already had. Dad blaming me for ruining everything. But I also thought about being 25 years old, still paying off debt I never created, still unable to rent my own apartment or get approved for a student loan because my mother had stolen my financial identity when I was a child. I filed the identity theft reports in early July. The process was complicated, involving multiple forms and detailed documentation of every fraudulent account. I had to write a statement explaining that I hadn't authorized any of the credit card applications and that my mother had used my personal information without my knowledge or consent. Typing those words felt like a betrayal, even though they were true. I submitted everything online and then waited. Mom didn't know at first. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd done, so I just kept going to work and avoiding her at home. But about 3 weeks after I filed the reports, she got a letter from one of the credit card companies informing her that the account was under investigation for potential fraud. She burst into my room waving the letter, demanding to know if I'd reported her. I told her yes, I'd filed identity theft claims because I'd given her months to fix things and she hadn't. She exploded in a way I'd never seen before, screaming about how I was trying to destroy her life and send her to jail. Dad came running from the living room asking what was going on, and Mom turned her anger on him, saying this was all his fault for losing his job and putting them in this position in the first place. Dad yelled back that she was the one who'd committed fraud and she couldn't blame him for her decisions. They screamed at each other while I stood there feeling like I was watching my family implode. Eventually, Mom stormed out of the house, getting in her car and driving off without saying where she was going. Dad looked at me with this exhausted expression and asked why I'd filed the reports. I explained everything Michael had told me about protecting my future and how I couldn't spend the next decade paying for debt I didn't create. Dad sighed and said he understood, but that Mom was going to have a hard time forgiving this. I said maybe I didn't need her forgiveness, I just needed my life back. The next few weeks were tense. Mom barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was cold and clipped. She'd make dinner for herself and Dad, but leave me to fend for myself like I'd been excommunicated from the family. Dad tried to play mediator, but he wasn't good at it and mostly just avoided being home. I spent more time at work and at my friend Sarah's house, where her parents didn't ask too many questions about why I was always hanging around. In August, I got letters from 3 of the credit card companies stating they'd closed the accounts and removed them from my credit report as fraudulent. 2 others required additional documentation, which Michael helped me provide. By September, most of the accounts had been cleared and my credit score had jumped to 620, which still wasn't great, but was a massive improvement from where it had been. I felt lighter knowing those debts were no longer my responsibility, even though my relationship with my mom was essentially destroyed. Mom did end up facing some legal consequences, though not as severe as I'd feared. One of the credit card companies referred her case to the district attorney, who decided to charge her with identity theft. She got a court-appointed lawyer who negotiated a plea deal where she pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and got probation instead of jail time. She also had to pay restitution to the credit card companies, which meant she was now dealing with payment plans and collection calls herself. Part of me felt guilty about that outcome, but a bigger part felt vindicated. She'd committed a crime and stolen from her own child, and now she was facing appropriate consequences. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Still, watching my mom go through court proceedings and probation meetings was surreal and sad. Our relationship didn't recover. Even after I graduated high school and moved out for college, we barely spoke, maybe a phone call on holidays if that. Dad and I maintained a relationship, though it was strained. He never explicitly took sides, but I could tell he resented the legal trouble Mom had faced as a result of my actions. He'd make comments about how families should work things out privately, or how involving lawyers and courts just made everything worse. I'd remind him that Mom had destroyed my credit and stolen my identity, and he'd go quiet because he couldn't really argue with that. College was hard financially because I had to pay for everything myself without being able to take out student loans in my name for the first couple years while I rebuilt my credit. I worked full-time year-round at a restaurant and took classes part-time at community college. It took me 6 years to finish my bachelor's degree instead of 4, but I graduated with minimal debt because I'd been so careful with money after everything that happened. I'm 24 now with a decent job and an apartment I rent on my own. My credit score is around 720, which is pretty good all things considered. I still have trust issues around money, and I check my credit report obsessively every few months to make sure no one's opened anything in my name. When I started dating my boyfriend last year, I had a panic attack when he casually asked for my social security number to add me to his gym membership. He didn't understand why I freaked out until I explained the whole story, and even then I don't think he fully grasped how violated I felt by what my mom did. Mom and I have attempted reconciliation a few times, usually initiated by Dad, who feels guilty about our fractured family. We met for coffee last year and she apologized, saying she'd been desperate and made terrible choices. I accepted her apology, but I don't trust her and probably never will. She still tries to frame herself as the victim, sometimes talking about how hard those years were and how she was just trying to keep the family afloat. I don't have patience for that narrative anymore. She was an adult who made deliberate choices to commit fraud against her own child, and I was the one who had to live with the consequences. What bothers me most isn't even the money or the destroyed credit, it's the betrayal. Your parents are supposed to protect you and prepare you for adulthood, not sabotage your financial future before you're old enough to understand what's happening. Every time I had to explain to a landlord or a loan officer why my credit was terrible as a teenager, I felt that betrayal all over again. Every time I see my social security number on a form, I feel a spike of anxiety, remembering how something that should be private and protected was used against me by the person I trusted most. I've thought about writing down the whole story as a warning to other people about this kind of financial abuse because it happens more than anyone talks about. Parents think they can just borrow their kids' identity temporarily without real consequences, but the damage lasts for years. I'm one of the lucky ones because I found out before I turned 18 and had resources to fight back. Some people don't discover what their parents did until they're trying to rent their first apartment or buy a car, and by then the debt is even worse and harder to dispute. Looking back, I wish I'd acted sooner and not given Mom so many chances to fix things herself. But I was 16 and scared and desperately wanting to believe my parent would do the right thing. That hope kept me trapped in inaction for months while interest accumulated and my credit score dropped. I learned that sometimes protecting yourself means making really hard choices that hurt people you love, even when you wish there was another way. My relationship with money is complicated now. I'm extremely careful with spending and I keep detailed budgets, and I have emergency savings that I guard obsessively. Friends make fun of me for being too frugal or too anxious about finances, but they don't understand what it's like to lose control of your financial identity before you're even old enough to have one. That experience shaped how I view trust in family and the responsibilities parents have to their children. I still wonder sometimes if I made the right choice filing those identity theft reports. It destroyed what was left of my relationship with my mom and caused a lot of pain for everyone involved. But then I remember where I'd be right now if I hadn't 20-something years old still drowning in debt I didn't create, unable to build any kind of stable life for myself. The choice was between my future and my mother's comfort, and I chose myself. I had to.